Well, to get a bit more analysis on all of this, I'm joined on the set by France 24's Nadia Massih. Nadia, Tikhanovskaya is trying to get the EU to do many things, among them impose sanctions over this alleged vote rigging in the election in Belarus. Is she having any luck so far?
Well, she said that press conference just came to an end, and she said the talks with the EU today were fruitful, but it is clear she's pretty frustrated with what's been happening in the EU in the past couple of weeks. She said explicitly, not in that soundbite, but in another one earlier, that the European Union now needs to be harsher and braver. And what she's referring to is that for several weeks now, EU leaders have intended to impose sanctions on key officials in Belarus because of what's been happening since August the 9th. But now they're at deadlock, and that's because Cyprus is vetoing the move. Now, Cyprus is vetoing this not because the country is opposed to imposing sanctions on Belarus, but actually because of an entirely separate issue, which is that they want to see sanctions imposed on Turkey. So they're kind of using this issue as leverage and saying, if we're going to impose sanctions on Belarus, we've got to do it on Turkey too. And we understand there is deep frustration elsewhere in the EU over Cyprus holding this back. It's been nearly a month since the EU pledged that they would do something, they would impose sanctions. They've been unable to do so. And so frustrated is Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, that she said they may actually scrap one of the key tenets of the EU, which is that all 27 member states have to agree together in order for sanctions to be imposed, and instead just go for a simple majority, meaning they could kind of bypass the objections of Cyprus. But I think all of this just makes the EU look obviously divided, but it makes them look weak as well. It is quite ironic that all EU states think that sanctions should be imposed, but they can't get around to actually doing so. We are seeing the limitations of the EU today. Lots of words, lots of criticism, but not many actions.
Nadia, there's another key player here that could be having its effect as well on the EU decision-making process, and that's Russia.
Yeah, I think Russia is certainly having an impact on the fate of Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, and on the country itself. This is, of course, an ex-Soviet state, historically very linked to Russia. But in recent years, we've seen Lukashenko sort of trying to play Russia off against the West, cozy up to the EU to eventually try to gain concessions from Putin. And that's meant that Putin is very distrustful of Lukashenko. And what he really fears now is that these protests that we're seeing in Minsk will mean that the country will pivot away from Russia towards Europe. Now, the leaders of the opposition movement, including today, but for several weeks now, they have said, look, this is not about an ideological turn towards the West, and the protests in general don't have a particularly anti-Russian sentiment. Nonetheless, though, the EU is really wary about riling Putin. They remember what happened in 2014 when there were those protests in Ukraine, the deposing of a pro-Kremlin leader there, and eventually Russia intervening into Crimea. They are desperate to avoid something similar happening with Belarus, which is also why we're seeing this quite nuanced approach from the EU today, suggesting they will try to impose sanctions. They are critical of what happened during the election on August the 9th, but they don't intend any further action, and they're hoping that will satisfy Putin in the coming weeks.
Nadia, thank you for that. France 24's Nadia Massih.